T-4 and counting.
Good morning, and welcome to AirOccupy, the radio show that speaks truth to power and will occupy your mind for the next hour. I'm Liz, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Jerry and Shannon.
Hey, good morning.
Hey.
And we want to welcome our new listeners. Jerry and I were talking to a lot of people over the weekend about the radio show, and it's funny. People are into it. I hope you're listening, and you continue to listen. And we want to remind you, if you want to comment on anything that we're saying today, you can do that online at on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AirOccupy, or you can also send us a tweet, and our tweet handle is @AirOccupy. So today we're going to talk about the nuclear energy industry, and next week we'll be covering the continuing financial crises and fraud that's going on, and like Shannon said this morning, J.P. Morgan, LIBOR, Barclays, oh my. So that's next week. But today, it's been over a year since the Fukushima disaster that happened in Japan, and there have been a lot of questions about whether something nuclear meltdown could happen here in the United States, and I think the question is not if it could happen, but when it will happen. So we wanted to kind of open up with a look at the nuclear power industry in the United States and where we go from here.
Currently we have 104 commercial reactors, and it's good just to know for background, 69 of those reactors are the pressurized water reactor, and 35 are boiling water reactors, and that's the same design that was used at Fukushima. In fact, the GE Mark I design is the type of plant that operated in Fukushima, the 4 reactors. We're the world's largest market for nuclear power, domestic market. It's 20% of the electricity we generate, but all of the plants are pre-1974. Many of them have reached or are past their projected lives. As the century turned, there was a lot of talk about a nuclear renaissance in America, but for a lot of different reasons, mainly financial, we really haven't seen continued development and new plants coming online. Currently, there's a couple of new plants only in Georgia with 4 reactors that have been approved by the NRC, and there's a proposed plant here in Florida.
There's also County.
There's also one in South Carolina that just received its permits last year, but I'm not sure when that's going to come online.
So the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, issues permits for plants and is supposed to be the chief regulator of the industry. They've kind of had a storied history and a varied history due to kind of a dual mandate, similar to some of the other agencies we have, that they both promote the nuclear industry and also regulate it. But after Fukushima Daiichi, the NRC announced a comprehensive study of all of the existing plants in the U.S., including hopefully seismic studies. We have a number of plants, including 8 on the West Coast, that are in seismically active areas like Fukushima.
We also forget about other natural disasters. It's not just in the United States. It's not just earthquakes. We also have hurricanes and wildfires. I know last year Los Alamos, which is a research institute for nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, was threatened by forest fires.
And that wasn't the first time that's occurred. Actually, it's Los Alamos is a really good thing to talk about because it brings to light the issue of nuclear waste.
It does. And, you know, one of our guests, I forgot to mention our guest at the top of the hour, but we're going to be hearing from Linda Gunter from Beyond Nuclear, which is a 501c3 that deals with these issues. And at the end, at the bottom of the hour, we'll be talking with Alaric Balibrera, who is currently on a hunger strike over Los Alamos. So I think he's going to tell us a lot about what's going on there, what has gone on there, and why we need to change. So
Yeah, beyond the safety in the operations of the plants, as Shannon notes, the other big issue is what do we do with the nuclear waste? And just as a fact, there's 65,000 tons in temporary storage of nuclear waste in the United States. Most of that is kept in spent fuel pools on site at these plants, which has caused a number of problems at Fukushima because they were storing the spent fuel rods the same way. Currently, 9 states have a moratoria on new building without any answer to the disposal issue. And what do we do with this waste? The Yucca Mountain plan, which had been the promise to dry cast store this stuff deep in the earth, that plan was shelved in 2009, so we currently don't have a plan.
And anyway, the Yucca Mountain wouldn't hold all of our current nuclear waste material that we have. So it's not a great solution, first of all. And then second of all, what are we going to do with all this other stuff?
So where is the waste now?
Good question.
Well, a lot of it's in these pools.
And there's also 30,000 Cold War era steel drums in the middle of the desert under a tent.
So I think some of it's being transported around on trucks.
Oh, on trucks.
That used to be the plan until Yucca Mountain was to be put into play. But
I actually have an article on that from the New Mexican in 2000 where they note the winding roads and the many accidents that occur. Northern New Mexicans couldn't help but wonder, what if the trailer in question were toting nuclear waste? I mean, can you imagine?
No. and that puts a whole new spin on on the argument that we need to update our infrastructure.
A couple other facts, just for background. Here in Florida, nuclear issues and the permits and whatnot, at least in part, go through the Florida Public Service Commission, which recently changed some rules which allow Progress and FPL customers to be charged by those companies to subsidize about $300 million in so-called upgrades to plants and the study of whether or not new plants should be built. Interestingly, even if those new plants aren't eventually built after study, FPL and Progress will be keeping the money that we paid in advance.
Oh, nice. That's nice. Is that under the Lieberman-Warner bill by any chance? It never mentions nuclear, but it's actually in 2006 established that 25% of all funds deposited into new climate change worker training should the Lieberman-Warner bill establishes for climate clean energy. It basically lays it out so that only nuclear can fill that under this law.
Right, that was a federal law. The Florida Public Service Commission is the different sort of regulatory rate, setting the rates for what we can be charged on our electric bills. So
that's done through the name of these laws are called construction work in progress laws. And basically what that means is a utility company can charge you for work that they're going to do in the future, and if they decide not to do that work, they can actually keep that money. There are several states that have these laws, such as North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, and Maine has these type of laws. Mostly they're used by the nuclear energy power plants because they're so expensive to build, and no one wants to pay for the building of them, so bonds won't sell. So they can't issue bonds. They have to get this money from their customers to build these.
They also rely, in good measure, and the Georgia plants relied on federal loan guarantees.
Yes. Yeah.
So the market's determined that these aren't financially viable anymore, but we insist on continuing down this path.
Yeah. So if you're in a state that, one of the states that I didn't mention, keep your eyes peeled for something called construction work in progress laws. I know that they came up this past session in Iowa, and Iowa actually closed their session without voting on it. I know that it's going to come up next session, and I hope that the Iowa legislators will continue to stall this law because it's not good for anyone. We end up paying for this, paying for the nuclear energy for dangerous practices. Well,
this is supposed to be the utility market, and it's supposed to operate on market principles and capitalism, but this stuff is protected by the government, loan guarantees, liability limitations is a whole different chapter of this that the energy industry has been able to get caps on what they would be liable for in the case of a disaster.
Right. If you want to look up this type of law in Florida, it's called the Florida Energy Act of 2006, and that's where you can find the construction work in progress law.
2006 must have been a busy year.
Yeah. Well, that's when that's when the nuclear energy industry announced its renaissance. So we're coming back to nuclear energy. We're coming back to, nuclear energy.
I think it's worth noting that contrary to popular belief, nuclear is about the same as solar and more expensive than wind.
Cost-wise, that's interesting.
Yeah.
There are so many hidden costs in all of this that aren't right on the table. I mentioned before the Florida Public Service Commission allowing Progress and FPL to pre-collect up to $300 million for these upgrades and studies of new plant capacity. Unmentioned in all of that is if they went online with the power they're projecting to use with new plants, you'd need a $4 billion upgrade to the grid to handle the power. So there are many levels of costs and risk costs that we haven't evaluated properly when comparing the cost of wind and solar and geothermal and other types of less dangerous energy sources.
Right, and I think it's very hard for, at least for me, I know, to think about the costs because if there is a nuclear spill, we're not talking in years or hundreds of years or even thousands of years for the cleanup. It's an unbelievably long time, way beyond our lifetimes. So if something does happen, the impact, we're passing it down to our great kids.
Our guest can and will be speaking to sort of the particulars about that. But in Japan yesterday there was a demonstration. 170,000 people came out to protest the government's handling of the disaster itself, the misinformation that came out that continues to this day, the dangers in the area, the dangers to the water, and they're going back on the moratorium on nuclear power. They're going to refire plants, and people are not happy.
Yeah.
They're refiring under the that there's not going to be enough power, despite the fact that they've done without nuclear power for over a year now, and there's been no shortage.
Threaten the shortage.
The government's going to come up, I guess, at the end of August. The Japanese government is going to release what they say is their plan for nuclear energy, and it looks like it's going to be the 15% solution, which would require all of 50 of Japan's reactors, all but one of which is now idled for safety checks, to resume operations before gradually closing the older units. So it looks like Japan is going back to nuclear. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's the people in Japan. It's considered impolite and radical to protest. So, I mean, you have to imagine the level of concern if they're able to overcome that stigma.
The people
to
were in the
stand out
street
there.
yesterday in
Yeah.
Tokyo. It was an impressive sight.
Very impressive sight. We'll have pictures of that on our Facebook page, and looks like we're gonna take a little break. And on the other side of the break, we'll be talking with Beyond Nuclear about some of these issues and where we're going. And enjoy.
Bring her up.
And we're back. We will be talking in just a second with Linda Gunter of Beyond Nuclear. Linda Gunter was one of the founders of this organization, and she's the international specialist at Beyond Nuclear. So we're going to talk to her about Fukushima. She's formerly a journalist, and she writes and blogs for Beyond Nuclear as well. Just a comment on that song that you heard before. It's called Radioactivity by Kraftwerk, which was played at the No Nukes 2012 concert in Japan, and they changed the last. It was Chernobyl, Harrisburg, which was 3 Mile Island, Sellafield, which is in England, which has had many spills, and Hiroshima. And for the concert in Japan, they actually added Fukushima. So anyway, we're going to talk with Linda. Hi, this is AirOccupy. You're on the air.
Thank you.
Hi, Linda.
Good to be with you. Hi.
Welcome.
Hi.
We wanted to start out a little bit just talking. I don't know if you heard any at the beginning of the show, but we were reviewing the nuclear industry in the United States. And I know that Beyond Nuclear has done a lot of studies about the international issues in Fukushima. And if you could just tell us a little bit about your organization.
Yes, well, our primary focus is really the U.S. Obviously, that's where we're based, and we've been watchdogging the nuclear industry and its lapdog regulator collectively for almost 100 years as individuals. But with Beyond Nuclear, which was founded in 2007, obviously since then. But we do look at other countries as well, sometimes as examples of similar failures like we've seen in Japan, and sometimes as examples of where we could or could have gone, like Germany, which is renounced nuclear and is aiming to have 80 to 100% renewable energy on the grid by 2050. So, while we do focus on trying to shut the reactors that are here in the U.S., especially the 23 that are the same flawed design as those at Fukushima Daiichi, we also, keep a good eye on the international scene as well, because nuclear power knows no boundaries, and that's not only sort of figuratively speaking, but literally, as we've seen the plume clouds from Chernobyl and now Fukushima, cover the planet.
So if there is an internet, you say it knows no boundaries. If there is a crisis, and I was looking up the International Nuclear Event Scale, which Chernobyl was 7, as was Fukushima, how far do the radioactive particles, how far can they go? How big of an area are we looking at?
I mean, it literally depends on which way the wind blows, and it depends on how much radioactivity was released. And the answer to all those questions, and even this idea of, having a grading scale, is all a little bit dubious in my mind, because it's very difficult to measure and to say, well, this is worse than that. I mean, obviously, Chernobyl, the entire reactor exploded, released its entire radioactive entry at once, but it was a relatively new plant. Fukushima, we had 3 meltdowns and a 4th explosion, and the monitors were not monitoring for particulates, only for gases. So we really don't know, I don't think, the level of contamination other than where it has been measured. It's very difficult when you discharge that amount of radioactivity into the sea, for example. The industry likes to say the solution to pollution is dilution, but that's not necessarily the case when it gets biomagnified up the food chain from small organisms to larger ones. They're finding cesium in tuna now that have migrated from Japan. So I think the true extent of this particular disaster, which is in fact not over, because we still don't know the exact condition of Reactor 4 and what could happen if, hopefully this won't happen, but if there's another big earthquake anytime soon, it could be orders of magnitude worse. So I think that it's a very difficult thing to measure, also because of the health effects. This is a dispersed population now. It'll be very hard to track the health effects, and very easy for the industry and governments to dismiss them as negligible, when in fact they will take 20 to 30 years in some cases to manifest, will pass down to future generations. And again, it's hard to prove sometimes, this leukemia was caused by that particular event. But I think, when you look at probability, there's going to be a very high toll paid in human and animal life because of this ongoing disaster.
What's the state currently of the kind of no-go zone in the area around the plant where people are restricted?
It's fundamentally, I understand that it's fundamentally deserted, except for elderly folks who felt that they had not that long to live anyway, and that they would die before any ill effects of the radiation exposures would get them.
What an incredible calculation to be making.
Yeah, but there's some, actually, we've just put them on our website. There's a really interesting series of films that were shot by an American who's been based in Japan for 10 years, and they're beautiful, actually. They're very lyrical. I mean, he just goes periodically back into those areas and talks to people 2 months after the accident, goes back a year after the disaster, where the farms have been abandoned. And it's heart-wrenching, to see people who've had to make that decision to give up their lives, well, not their lives, but their livelihoods and their lifestyles and the lives that they know, and the places that they grew up in or farmed, and their animals had to be slaughtered, and, they just had to basically abandon it, and so it's just vacant. That said, the evacuation zone wasn't nearly big enough, so there were people moved to places which turned out to be more contaminated than the places they moved from. Okay. And they were moved again, or they were moved only 2 months after the disaster began, and probably too late. And all these interviews are in these series of films, and that it sort of brings home that the level of what the Washington Post here had the audacity to describe as non-catastrophic.
Wow.
The level of the catastrophe is, I think, immeasurable, because how do you measure having your entire life destroyed? The pain and suffering of individuals who don't get leukemia, who don't die of cancers, who are not, harmed from a health point of view, but are harmed in other ways, needs to be taken into account, I think, and is often not. And that's what I find so horrifying here, is this sort of callous indifference, not only to the suffering of the people in Japan, but to the potential of the exact same thing happening in the U.S., and the complete and utter refusal of our administration, of our regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to do anything reasonable to prevent it. What we see consistently is a adherence, a capitulation to whatever the industry wants that fits their bottom line and their profit margins, and a blind eye turned to the reality that we could have innumerable Fukushimas here, because we've got 23 of the same design, all of which have the exact same flaw, which compounded the problems that occurred there. So it's sort of a, what are you waiting for? And that's why I think the Occupy movement actually has a lot to teach the anti-nuclear movement, and indeed a lot of that is being adopted now by the anti-nuclear movement, to say we have to go to them and take over and say, look, this is not acceptable. We're going to be here till you change things, because these are risks that are not acceptable to be taken. Gambling with people's lives on a daily basis to save a nuclear industry money that can't stand on its own 2 feet is not an acceptable modus operandi.
Right.
Does the comprehensive NRC study that's been undertaken hold any promise of any reforms?
Which comprehensive NRC study
well,
are you referring to?
We hear a lot about that the NRC has undertaken a study. I read a lot about it.
Fukushima's lessons learned?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a classic example of lessons unlearned.
Mm-hmm.
What they're doing is issuing orders that don't take into account, they're ordering like the Mark I reactors to make fixes that will not take into account the level of catastrophic accident that happened in Fukushima, because that's just too unlikely here. That's kind of what they're telling us. It's sort of eye-stretching, really. So we're actually fighting that right now. These orders are completely useless. They've looked at what happened in Fukushima, and the lessons that they've decided to learn are none, as far as we can tell, to do nothing. And that's what's profoundly disturbing about the way the regulator operates. But it's nothing new. It's been like this, ever since it was founded. So it's not surprising that that's what's going on. But it means that we've got to just battle all the harder to try and get across the point that you cannot, these containments. Basically what they're saying is that when we've recognized that this reactor design, this General Electric reactor design that melted down and blew up in Fukushima, has a containment that if fuel damage occurs, which is what happened there, it will fail. 100% certainty it will fail. That's what we saw. And what the NRC has decided to do about that is nothing. And that's what we're up against. That they will not consider what they call post-fuel damage events. So once the fuel's damaged, we don't have to worry about it, because, we're not going to order any kind of retrofit to because they can't, because you can't really fix these. You've got to shut them. That's really the only answer.
Actually, that just happened. My mother called in. She was a writer for the St. Petersburg Times, and Crystal River has been shut down for several years because they had to do an upgrade and make repairs, and it was so expensive they decided to do it themselves and actually made it worse.
Right. I mean, the fact of the matter is that with the economics never add up with nuclear power, and so if you can mandate a retrofit, they will close because it's too expensive to do it. I mean, one of the retrofits that in fact has been recognized as the best available technology is not the kind of reactor that you see at Crystal River, which brings in millions of gallons of water, a day, and then discharges it at heat into the same environment. The cooling tower is a slightly better technology. Not that I adhere to the technology, but if you're going to improve it, that's the first thing you would do. None of those reactors that don't have cooling towers are going to retrofit them because it's too expensive. They're better off closing. So, I mean, the other campaign afoot is, not only to close these reactors that are the most dangerous first, but to keep the ones that have had to close down, like San Onofre in California, and Fort Calhoun, which was entirely surrounded by floodwater, to keep them shut. Because, funnily enough, the lights have not gone out in Southern California since San Onofre has been shut down. So the most important thing is to be able to replace this power quickly with renewables, efficiency, and conservation, and make them obsolete, which they fundamentally are in most cases already in terms of their contribution to the grid. And that's what's happened in Germany, really, with their feed-in tariff system. I mean, they are able to put all their renewable energy onto the grid first, and so then you only add the old dinosaurs of fossil fuel and fissile fuel if you need them. And gradually, as you build up a greater contribution to the grid from renewables, you will need them less and less, and ultimately not at all. And that's really what needs to happen here. But we have neither the feed-in tariff system nor a political system that enables that kind of change to happen easily. So it's a huge undertaking to change it, but if we don't start, it never will happen.
If you just joined us, this is AirOccupy, and we're talking with Linda Gunter of Beyond Nuclear about Fukushima and all the nuclear problems. Just if you have a comment, please post it on our Facebook page or tweet it to us. We can only take one phone call at a time, and we'd love to hear from you, so join in the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, more to your point, we often hear in the States through popular media that alternative energy sources are not economically competitive with, I guess, what was once described the meterless energy source that we get from nuclear. What's your view of that?
Well, I mean, the old thing was too cheap to meter, which was never true about nuclear energy. It was just the idea that it might be. But that never happened. I mean, obviously, wind power has become, I think, not only the fastest growing, but one of the cheapest forms of providing electricity to the grid. So it's all a question of, how you fund things. And unfortunately, in the case of nuclear, the lion's share of the energy budget, research and development chunk has gone to nuclear over the decades. I mean, it was a sort of 60% to a couple of percent to renewables, that inched up to 10%. So they've never had the infrastructural support or fundamental, cushion that the nuclear industry's had. That said, the nuclear industry still cannot stand on its own 2 feet financially and is reliant on huge subsidies. And, in some states, taxpayers pay. Ratepayers have to pay in their electric bills for future plants that may one day be or not be built. This is called construction work in progress, QIP, you have in Florida, and it just, it's just had the gravy train for way too long, and I think that there's an opportunity to do it right here. But the difficulty, I think, also is the political system, because we don't have proportional representation. So that means that, when we go to the polls and you look at the choices of who you can vote for, the person that you want to vote for has no chance of winning.
Right.
If they're not the Democrat or the Republican, there's the Green Party or somebody independent who's got good environmental views or whatever, they won't get elected. It's a winner-take-all. Instead of a proportional representation where that person would be elected to represent the proportion of people who agree with him or her. and then they have a voice, and that's how you build change. And that's how the Green Party was able to become so significant in Germany, in part because of that. It helps to have been dumped on by the Chernobyl plume and understand what it really feels like to live through a nuclear disaster and the consequences that might mean. And, we've had that. We've had two major nuclear disasters in this country. One was 3 Mile Island, where they shut off the meters, so we really don't know how much radioactivity got out and dumped on people. So, there was a fabulous cover-up there. And the other one is an even bigger radiological disaster that no one's heard of, which happened 3 months later, on July 16th, 1979, in Church Rock, New Mexico, where 93 million gallons of radioactive waste went into the Rio Puerco from a broken tailings dam at a uranium mine. But that only affected Navajo, so it didn't count at all. I'm being sarcastic here, I hope you realize. And so therefore, that's the biggest accident that this country's ever seen that nobody knows about, which was the same year as 3 Mile Island. So we've been kept very much in the dark about what it actually feels like to live through it, because precautions were not taken afterwards, really, to safeguard people, other than those pregnant mothers and children who are evacuated from the immediate area of 3 Mile Island. We've really been there's been a sort of pretty good cover-up here when there's been something like that happen. So, and a lot of denial, and we don't have by and large, we don't have a media that does real journalism and actually digs and investigates facts. They just want a good old shouting match, on the TV between a he said and a she said. But the reality of what's going on, there's very little good work being done. It's mostly being done by independent media that don't, average Joe doesn't see.
Right. That's really true. I mean, there's not even coverage of what we do with waste in this country. I think if people really registered, where it is, and what's going on with it, there'd be such an outcry. And we're talking from the Cold War. We don't know what to do with the waste.
Right. We've never known from the first cupful, and we're actually about to reach the 70th year. In December 2nd of this year will be the 70th year since the first cupful of waste was generated at Fermi, at the Fermi lab in Chicago. And we're actually sort of planning a big, I don't know what you call it, because you don't really want to call it anniversary or commemoration, but, we're going to mark the date, let's say, and say, look, we have a mountain of waste 70 years high that no one has ever figured out what to do with and may never figure out what to do with. And so the most obscene thing you can do is to continue making it. That is, you don't let a child, if you have a kid, you don't tell them never to clean up their room. Oh, just keep making a mess. That's okay. Eventually it becomes unlivable, the room. I mean, you clean the mess up as you go, and you have a plan for what to do with it before you make it. We all have trash cans in our houses. We know what we're going to do with our trash before we trash the place. But the nuclear industry never had a plan. That we'll deal with this later. Well, now it's later, and we haven't dealt with it. And so now there's a commission under the Obama's Department of Energy, Blue Ribbon Commission, that has been tasked miraculously in the space of 2 years to come up with a solution to what to do with the waste. Because, and there's I guess, a good level of lobbying still to go back to the Yucca Mountain plan, which hopefully won't happen. But what they think they're going to do with it, the best plan they've come up with, is to take it from the reactor sites to what they call centralized interim storage, which is basically dumping it in sort of parking lot style somewhere, probably Indian reservations, because that's where they've tried before, paths of least resistance. We'll wave a lot of money at you so you can take this stuff that will, endanger your lives and give you absolutely no benefit whatsoever. And it'll sit there, quote unquote, temporarily until we come up with a final repository or whatever to move it to. So this is an insane idea, because it means first you've got to move it. So it's on the roads, rails, and barges, and then you're going to put it somewhere where it's outside in plain sight, a lovely sabotage target. And then it's got to be secure, and it's got to last, and then potentially you might move it again somewhere else. It's sort of like it's on a truck moving around from place to place. It's homeless.
And that's safe.
And it's a terrible plan. So that's the next thing we've got to confront, is to stop this centralized interim storage plan, which is being pushed by the DOE.
That storage, I mean, I was reading about the potential effects of groundwater through leakage of this temporary storage we already have. I mean, I don't think just because an accident hasn't happened yet, well, actually it has, but just because that particular accident hasn't happened yet that we know of, or the fires that we just had that threatened Los Alamos, the flood, as you mentioned, where the EPA took measurements and then stopped taking measurements.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that the worst does happen. And unfortunately, we tend to be a sort of reactive species, you know? We react to either clear and present danger or after it's occurred. How do we clean it up or fix it, or what do we do now? Rather than the preventive, we have no precautionary principle in play most of the time. So therefore, even when things happen, the burden of proof is on the victim, not on the perpetrator. When there have been studies done, for example, in France, around the La Hague reprocessing facility of cancer clusters and childhood leukemias, the burden of proof always comes back, well, you can't prove that it was this facility that caused these cancers. The people whose children died are supposed to prove that the La Hague facility was the cause of their children's deaths, whereas in reality, if you understand that exposure to ionizing radiation causes leukemia, and you've got one of the biggest discharges of ionizing radiation sitting on a peninsula just, 50 miles or less, 20 miles up the road from your house, then if you were a detective, you would say that's my prime suspect. And therefore that prime suspect needs to demonstrate innocence first. But it's always the other way around.
Yeah.
The people who have no money and no power are supposed to go to court and show that they were afflicted by the incredible amounts of radioactive discharges from that facility, and that's true everywhere. And so I think that's always been, that's true of the uranium miners. They've got to prove, in order to get any compensation, they've got to prove definitively that mining uranium is what caused their malady. It's just backwards, really, and it's cumbersome and it's slow, and most of them die before they ever get a dime. And so it's sort of, the whole nuclear fuel chain is fundamentally inhumane. It's a violation of human rights from the beginning to the end, and needs to be viewed that way, but is not.
So, I know we're coming to the end here, but before we did, I wanted to just, what do we do? What recommendations do you have? What actions should we take next?
Well, I think, we have to recognize that we must shut the most dangerous ones first. We have a campaign called Freeze Our Fukushimas. Each community where there is a reactor just like that, we're building advocacy to make it, really, I think you have to make it politically expedient for your elected officials to side with that, to say, okay, if we're electing you to represent us, then you have to protect our best interests. And not letting us get irradiated by this reactor is in our best interest. So we just won't elect you if you continue to support the operation of this nuclear plant. We'll find somebody else. So you have to make it politically expedient to join with those who feel that their health and safety is in danger to shut these plants. Then I think we have to build a movement that allows renewable energy to supplant nuclear, because in shutting things, you must have an alternative plan. So I honestly think advocating for proportional representation and a proper feed-in tariff are the way to go. Because if you have a proper feed-in tariff, which means that everybody from a farmer with a wind turbine farm to you with 3 solar panels on your house sells all the electricity you generate to the grid, and you sell it first. You are guaranteed that you sell it. Utility cannot come back and say, no, we're running our nuclear plant right now, we're not going to buy your electricity. They have to take your electricity first, which means that the more of that there is, the less need you have for coal plants and nuclear plants. Because, obviously coal has to go too.
Right.
And so if you're going to close nuclear and close coal and, bridge even temporarily with gas in an emergency, you've got to get renewables on the grid fast, and that's really what needs to happen here. So the more we can advocate for that, and for the renewable energy movement and the anti-nuclear peace movement, the peace movement, the anti-nuclear weapons movement, the anti-nuclear power movement, and the renewable energy, green movements to coalesce and say, right, this is all in our interest. Nuclear power leads to nuclear weapons. Nuclear power inhibits addressing climate change. Those are the two biggest threats we face. We must coalesce. We must advocate for getting clean energy onto our grid ASAP,
Yes.
And
Well,
also to promote the fact with our public officials that you do not represent us if you continue to advocate for endangering our lives by supporting nuclear energy.
Wonderful recommendations. Linda, thank you so much for coming on our
You're
show.
welcome.
The Beyond Nuclear, you can find more information. Beyond Nuclear has a wonderful website, which is very, very informative, and I recommend all of our listeners go check it out. It's at www.beyondnuclear.org. And thanks again, Linda.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Bye.
So we're going to go take a short break, and the song you're going to hear is by a pop group in Japan. And this group was disinvited to the Fuji Rock Festival last year after recording this song. And because the song criticizes the Japanese government, the music and broadcast industry openly admitted that they were not going to play it. So we're going to play it here, and hope you enjoy. Hi, this is AirOccupy. You're back. We're going to be talking with Alaric Balibrera, who is with an organization. He's actually doing a hunger strike right now. Hi, this is AirOccupy. You're on the air.
Hi, this is Alaric.
Hi.
How you
Thank
doing,
you so
Alaric?
much for calling in.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your organization and what you're doing. I understand that you started a hunger strike on Sunday.
I actually started it yesterday up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the laboratory is that built the first nuclear bomb.
Mm-hmm.
That did the bomb, actually, Fat Man and Little Boy built both of them. They destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yesterday was the end of the 67th anniversary of the first atomic detonation ever down at Trinity Site in southern New Mexico. So we started on that date as a kind of symbolic gesture, and I'm doing it with a coalition of groups, including Vets for Peace New Mexico, Occupy Santa Fe, NukeFreeNow.org, which is the site to go to for information on the events that are happening on the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th of August, coming up in about 3 weeks. Those are the dates because on August 6th we bombed Hiroshima, and August 9th bombed Nagasaki. And so those are the commemoration dates, and there's going to be a big 4-day event with speakers, films, music, hunger strikers, all from Friday night and actions on Monday through actions on Monday. So it's a big deal this year, and I'm so grateful to be a part of it and have this opportunity to stand up and have a voice finally. Because I grew up in Alamos, and way before the days of video or cable television or anything, my father was the film documentarian for the laboratory, which in Los Alamos, that's the only employer there is. There's only one employer in Los Alamos, and that's the laboratory. And so everyone's father is a rocket scientist, and my father was the film documentarian, so I grew up seeing images of the bomb exploding on my living room wall. I met a whole bunch of Nobel laureates. I'm the father of the hydrogen bomb. Edward Teller was one of my father's really good friends. And so I met all these people, and I got this side of the story. You know, it was a very strange growing up, and you have to be warned not to touch any of the discarded ordnance, you know, or you might blow up. Don't play in the streams or creeks, or you'll get cancer and die later.
Wow.
Man.
And so, when Occupy finally broke out last year, I was so incredibly grateful because it'd been so long since I'd been waiting to, you know, I had really not seen a mass movement. And when Occupy broke out, I just finally thought, here it is. Now's the time.
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt too. I was very psyched to see Occupy and what it was doing. But you know, I'm very excited about what you're doing too. I mean, you're putting your life and health on the line for the life and health of all of us, and I commend you for that.
That's a pretty serious statement.
Hunger strike's a committed act, and I'm just curious personally how you came to the point where, beyond demonstrating and whatnot, that you thought that this was your moral obligation, I guess, to engage in a hunger strike. What led you to this point?
Well, it seems to me that a hunger strike is really an appropriate response for the situation that we're facing. I mean, the LANL, Los Alamos National Laboratory, is bad enough, you know, but everything else, the system is so rotten and the system is so broken that I just despair of hope sometimes, and finally, when I got the chance to make a statement, I just didn't want to go out and bang a pot. You know, I really wanted to start a movement, and already we have 30 hunger strikers striking with me.
Wow,
that's amazing.
Wow. That's great.
It's not just me. So if any of your listeners want to donate an hour or a day or 3 days or 21 days, or just like me, just strike indefinitely, then go to NukeFreeNow.org and sign up on the hunger strike page. And I don't know, I don't have much hope, to be honest, but what hope there is, I want to create with everybody I can.
Oh yeah.
So it's really important to me, and that's why I'm doing it.
That's great.
I can really get with that. I mean, I think that's all of us have the same kind of thing, that, you know, we can at least do something. At least it's better than just sitting there waiting.
Yeah, I feel like if I don't raise my voice now, you know, there may not be a tomorrow to raise my voice.
Amen. Yeah.
It's that kind of thing, especially when you live around Los Alamos.
Oh, I can't imagine.
I grew up a mile from what's called Tech Area G, which is 42,000 barrels of transuranic radioactive waste buried in barrels. And in 2001, there was a gigantic fire that, this is a forest fire 25,000 degrees hot that came within 1,000 miles of Tech Area G. That's about a kilometer from where I grew up.
That's incredible.
If that forest fire had reached those 42,000 barrels, you know what they're covered by? A tarp tent.
That's ridiculous.
What happens if that fire reaches those barrels?
Those barrels go up, 40,000 barrels go up like popcorn.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Alaric, thank you so much for calling. If anybody wants more information about the hunger strike and wants to join in, then go to nukefreenow.org and...
Right, they can also follow on Twitter at HungerStrikerLA.
Okay, thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Alaric.
Thank
Have a good
you.
day. Okay.
Thanks, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye. This is AirOccupy, and next week we're going to be looking at why are we still talking about the financial industry crises? Why isn't anyone in jail?
Amen.
The next play out is in memory of Dev Smith.
Yep.
Peace.
Peace.
It skips our rights. Sheep to slaughter the lamb to her long stand. It's easy to kick ass, and the man got bodies bent backwards with heads in the sand. Stuck.